Welcome back to the discussion, Government Imperatives for Data Management in the Cloud, sponsored by Commvault and Amazon Web Services, here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. My guests today are Greg Garcia, Chief Information Officer of the Army Corps of Engineers. Frank Konechny is Chief Technology Officer of the Air Force. Dan Kaysen is Senior Manager of Worldwide Public Sector for Amazon Web Services, and Craig McCullough, Vice President for Commvault Federal Sales. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. And let's talk about the very topic that I just named, which is imperatives for data management. It's one thing to drag and drop files. I guess you could do that to move them into a cloud if, in its simplest explanation, the cloud is just a drive that's somewhere else. But I suspect that's not really the best way for data management in the cloud as you move these assets there. So again, we'll start with Greg this segment again. What are some of the strategies you use to make sure that when you make that move of data and applications and program data to the cloud, what do you do to prepare it such that the move is correct and efficient?
I think, well again, Tom, thanks for having us. I think one of the great ways to start is to really work on that app rationalization activity. Is the applications you have and the data that those applications create really in the best posture? Is there duplication? Is there redundancy? Do you have 4 time management systems? Do you have 5 ways to do financial assessments? To really kind of narrow down your number of ends that you want to move. And there's really a rules of aggregation of that data that's behind that strategy. So in the Corps of Engineers, we use a lot of geospatial data. We have a geospatial agency that works as a component of the Corps of Engineers. How many map references do we use? Which map reference do we use? So we can use lat longs, you can use GPS, you can do a lot of back-end ways to capture data. I think that assessment of what the data element standard should be before you move and how you disaggregate that into a common set of profiles of data is really critical to do before you do any movement at all.
And you have a structured process for doing that.
Yes, it's really a structured process of understanding what data you possess, which at an enterprise level. Some of this is very well known at the functional level or subject matter expert level. They'll know everything that they have in their applications. But that when you go to the next cubicle or the cubicle down the stairs or a cubicle across the country, how do they perceive their data, which may have some commonality with what you have? So that's really that enterprise understanding, enterprise responsibility of data understanding and data desegmentation to understand what's essential to take to the cloud.
And what about redundancy? Because you mentioned maps, and a lot of people in the Army use maps, and they might be using, 100 people could be using the same map for a different part of the same project. Yeah. Do you need to move 100 copies of that terabyte-sized map?
Let's hope not, right? Because I don't want to pay for that. But that's really the conundrum: is what is your enterprise, right? So how big is your E? As I like to how to say it. Is the Corps engineer defer to the Army? Does the Army defer to the DoD? Does the DoD defer to the federal government? And does that become so cumbersome that you can't move at all? So I think that's what we talked about in the first segment, is you've got to do practical mission examples for the organization at hand. So we're going to partner with the Army, we're going to partner with DoD, but we're not going to necessarily try to get in that queue that is too long for our mission's sake. So we're going to do specific activity within the Corps of Engineers that enhances our mission effectiveness and helps reduce cost burden to our projects and our programs.
Okay, I'll ask the same question of Frank. What do you do to prepare the applications you choose to move to the cloud and to make sure that you're efficient in the cloud use and also that the availability is there and all those good things?
One of the first things you have to do is determine how you're going to use those applications and who's going to use those applications. Remember, the Air Force is a worldwide organization. Putting something in one location is maybe not sufficient for everybody else across the world. Mm-hmm. And so you have to look at it across as what mission am I trying to provide to these people out there to actually maintain that mission. And that's one of the first criteria. The other criteria is, what is the data source that you're actually using? We have a lot of things we call authoritative data sources. Some of the applications may not be using authoritative data sources. So based on our data strategy right now, we're trying to determine what an authoritative data source is and make sure that all the applications are using those authoritative data sources across the board. Because otherwise you're getting data second and third hand, which doesn't help anybody. And as we move applications, the question always is okay, besides an application, besides the users out there, there's applications that use the data too. And so you may move an application to a cloud, but that application or that database may be fed by 5 to 10 other applications, and they may feed 5 other 10 applications. And so what you want to do is you want to move the cluster to the same cloud, because otherwise all your transaction flows are going to be all over the place. Especially if you use multiple clouds and multiple locations, you'll be spending all your time looking at COM and how moving it around and never try to figure out what's happening to that COM. So you have to do that prep also as to exactly who is needing the data, applications, personnel, as well as where the data resides and who's actually getting them. And we do have a lot of geospatial stuff too.
Right,
say
sure.
the least.
And so when there are non-authoritative data sources coming into workflows and applications, that means people are probably maybe doing workarounds, or they're just trying to get their jobs done.
Or they may not be getting the right data. That's the worst one, is they're not getting the right information, they're not getting the current information that they need to make their decisions, and they're basing it on old data. And so we're trying to avoid that particular problem space right away by saying, we only want you to use authoritative data from now on. Now that's a big change, because it means that you have to be able to provide that authoritative data to everybody who needs it, which is a cultural change.
Program out the possibility of them accessing the non-authoritative.
Yeah, that has to be stopped.
So
we're
you
trying
want
to
to
figure out a way.
virtualize all that before you move it to the cloud.
Yes.
And you mentioned there might be several instances because of geographic. I mean, as the World Air
Yes, and
Force
you have to-
operates in all time zones
And
and
you got
every
to talk about how
continent.
you're going to federate and copy it across multiple instances. That gets messier, because there's one source for that data usually, or the updates to that data, which is an application, but then you might want to federate that data across the world.
Mm-hmm. So therefore, you need to kind of engineer in a way of syncing it all, so
Yes.
that whatever someone accesses at a given point from a given location, eventually there's a physical cloud somewhere with a virtual machine, but nevertheless, that data has to be the same one as someone else
Within a certain time
3
period.
time zones away doing the same thing.
Right.
Especially in, I would say, on missions.
Yes,
where
mission critical data has to be produced all over the place very quickly.
everybody goes to the same place and,
That's right.
and stays, 500 yards
Especially
apart.
when we're talking about looking at videos and other things.
Interesting. So it gets complicated.
Yes, say the
All right.
least. A lot of engineering needs to be done.
Yeah, and Craig, what are best practices for preparation?
I think a lot of it stems from the basic fact that you have to know what data you have in order to manage it properly, be able to access it, protect people from accessing the wrong data, and recognizing what is the wrong data, much as Frank and Greg were discussing. So I think that the first step is to understand exactly what you have, what you're producing. If you are moving data or apps into the cloud, make sure that those apps are cloud ready when you do it, because a lot of times if you move too quickly, you'll have issues where the app you moved is no longer functioning properly or at all. Also, you want to make sure that your enterprise, no matter how disconnected physically it is, as everyone in the enterprise taps into the relevant data, that to them it is seamless, and maybe that data is contained in one central repository, maybe not a physical central repository, but to the apps, to the user, it looks like a central repository. That allows you to secure your data more timely and more robustly. It allows access to that data. It allows monitoring of that data, and it allows you to make that data actionable when it needs to be actionable. So I would think that those are some of the core tenets that you would look to when making that move.
Okay, and Dan, are there specific software stacks available from clouds that can speed this whole process along?
Yeah, and it's an interesting point, because one of the best practices, I would say, is, and I use this cliche in a little bit, is best practice, use best practices. And one is not to do it yourself. That a lot of the things out there, we talk about the complexity of moving to the cloud. Gosh, we got to do app rationalization, and we have to do data segmentation, deployment. Oh, and then we get to the cloud, we have to manage it, we have to replicate it, we have to back it up, we have to secure it. Wow, why are we even doing this? And the answer is because there's real benefit to having it in the cloud. I think that's the expectation. And on top of that, there are tools out there that make it a lot easier than it really sounds. It is complex. There is engineering challenge. But what I what I find often is when people start doing things on their own, and AWS has built-in capabilities for things like data replication. We have multiple regions. We have regions throughout the world globally, capability to replicate data throughout regions within a particular region for high data redundancy, et cetera. But and many times organizations need a higher level than that. And then, for example, I was working with one customer who was building their own strategy for how to do moving data through levels of retrievability from hot storage to cold storage and all that. And they're building their own architecture using complex scripts. And I'm like, well, why are you doing that? We have great partners like Commvault who have solutions. Why don't you just go and review that? So one of the things I can recommend is, and as you're planning this out, is really understanding the ecosystem of what's going to support you around there, both with solutions like Commvault provides that will help you get to the endpoint, as well as organizations that have done it. Because one of the good things in the area that we're right now is many organizations have done this, and there is a good body of work out there of best practices and expertise out there. Leverage them, and includes AWS and our partners as well. So leverage them to get through that, because the tools are there. There are fantastic low-level and even higher-level capabilities built into the cloud platforms themselves. But until you really know how to use them or how to rationalize them against other tools that are out there, it's going to be challenging to make the right choices.
Yeah, so what's your level of faith in knowing what you don't need to do and what your partners can do in the private sector?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tom. I think in the first segment we talked about why do you start small. I think it's all about relationships, right? So you have to understand the myriad of relationships that shift and change as you move from your current state to your future state. And part of that is there are specific roles and responsibilities, and some that are a bit gray, and that initial small tranche of activity really bears that out. You'll expose the gaps, you'll expose the overlaps, and really help you refine the responsibilities and roles. I mean, we have a specific cyber protection role. You have a specific, recoverability requirement. You have a latency requirement. You have a compute store. I mean, there's all sorts of factors, and I think that's why we talk about the complexity. Starting small, learning fast is really what the goal is to make those next increments of migration successful. And I think that's relying on so Frank and I are actually very much partnered on our Office 365 initiative. Finding a great teammate to work through these challenges is a big part of your process. I highly endorse the idea: don't go alone, don't be alone and unafraid. It is complex. Reach out, find a good partner, and then build those relationships.
Frank?
Yeah, I agree. But also you have to look at two other things too. I mean, you have to look at, why am I actually putting the data out there? I mean, this is our mission issue. And the apps are very important. I mean, this is the big thing with the apps. What should I actually do? What is the easiest way of getting it out there? Tool sets are cool. It's a culture change that you have to watch out for. I mean, that's what it comes down to at the bottom line, is that besides the apps, looking at the rationalization and moving them, you have to change the culture of the organization. Culture of the organization basically says, I don't trust anybody. So now I'm going to trust a vendor that I don't know about yet. But, and their motivation is profit. Okay, I understand that. Our motivation is not profit. Our motivation is mission and criticality and defending the United States. So it's a culture change to have the people say, I believe that I can trust these guys now. And how are you going to get that trust unless you start small and you build that trust with them? Because that's going to be the killer. Because, I mean, we have some people who say, I'm never going to move anything out of the DoD environment no matter what. I'm going to, keep that going no matter what, and I'm going to keep my staff and, everything else. And you're like, well, modern day techniques and tools are a lot faster than what you think they are, and a lot more effective, and probably are more secure. But no, the culture says, I can't do that. So besides, making sure the apps are there and everything else, you have to fix this culture issue with the trust. And I think that's the only way is like we trusted, Greg and I trust each other as organizations from DoD, yes. And so we have that trust already. But, to bring a vendor into that trust relationship takes a lot of work, and it has to be more than one vendor. So,
Right, sure. You just don't want to be too clubby.
That's right. You can't be too clubby.
Some other people. I want to get back to some of the technology topics here, and specifically backup, because we heard the term backup is important, and also redundancy is important for certain purposes. What's the difference between those two? Let's explore that. And also, when do you draw the line, or how do you know that you can do those things but not have excessive copies of data all over the place, which for a lot of reasons can be complicating. One, it's hard to synchronize, and two, it gives you a larger attack surface for people that want to take your data. So, Craig, what are some,
Sure.
how do you get there?
You know, from a backup perspective, and this kind of goes right to what Frank was just discussing. You know, you want to have copies of your data so that you can access them if they're corrupted or in any way compromised. And a lot of what we do actually, you know, with AWS is putting things in place that will allow that to happen. But also to Frank's point, you know, they don't want to be locked into one vendor, nor should they be from a U.S. government perspective. And one thing we pay very close attention to at Commvault is avoiding that vendor type of lock-in. So when we talk about backup, when we talk about redundancy, when we talk about accessibility to your data, either in the cloud or in your data center or in multiple data centers, that is driven by the goal of allowing the client to work with many companies across the board, not just one. And I think that that's an important part of keeping your infrastructure strong, accessibility to your data there, and forging strong partnerships where you can grow the relationships, grow the trust, and enter into new areas that help your enterprise achieve its mission-critical goals.
And Dan, with the rise of some of the new types of cybersecurity threats, such as malicious encryption, for example, and that may come through phishing or through all these different techniques to try to get payment for data and all of this, agencies probably have pretty good faith in their own processes now. Turns out, you know, seeing in some of the recent news, federal government's pretty good, you know, at protecting data relative to some very large data-based organizations. But how do you instill the trust, or how can they get the confidence that as they replicate in the cloud, that the same processes that keep them safe locally are there?
Yeah. I think the practices they're using for premises-based data security really don't change that much in the cloud. You want to leverage the right levels of encryption, the right levels of auditing and data access, and frankly, putting them into the cloud sometimes can make that an even more critical part of the role, because the exposure of the data could be that much larger. And on top of that, too, the amount of data coming in is going to be that much larger. We're all expecting data explosion. And, you know, it's already happening. It's going to happen, accelerate. You know, organizations that are looking to instill confidence, one, just need to continue to leverage the best practices and the tools to do it, and do it correctly. And there are a lot of great sources of information and management tools to do that, whether it's, again, data management policy, access control policy, encryption, all those kinds of things. The things that I can say, though, is the idea of backup does change a little, or has been changing. In the past, you talk about the malicious data encryption. Well, if you had a copy of your data, backup of your data, you're probably not that bad off, depending on when your RTO was. When was the last time you did that backup? And
5 minutes past before the encryption.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. In a world where you have, and the reason you had time backup is because it was expensive to store backups, and so the more frequent you did it, the higher the cost was. Well, the cost of data backup and the cost of data is going down so significantly that you can afford to do backups much more, I'd say, incrementally. And that's good, because now we're protected, and you can build that into your data management strategy, and cost isn't going to be an inhibitor anymore to protecting your data. It's just going to be a matter of process, and that's a good thing. Beyond that, and it was something that Craig had mentioned earlier, we change it from just having a backup to protect yourself to having actionable data. That data is no longer latent data just sitting aside that you only use if you need to go back to something. You can actually use that data now for business analytics, creating data lakes and other things. So our backups cease to become just stored copies, and it becomes a source of information that can be used for the future, and you build that into your strategy.
I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. This is Government Imperatives for Data Management in the Cloud, sponsored by Commvault and Amazon Web Services, here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM, federalnewsradio.com.